Mr. Speaker, the Glasgow Climate Pact, agreed by almost 200 countries, is a historic agreement which advances climate action. It was a result of 2 years of marathon work and a 2-week sprint of negotiations, following which the world can credibly say that we have kept within reach the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But to keep 1.5 alive, commitments must be translated into action.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister will be well aware that in Northern Ireland there's a huge farming and agriculture sector. What funding will his government give to that sector to allow us to get to net zero in a much, much quicker way?
Mr. Speaker, as you will know, the Department for Agriculture is doing an enormous amount in terms of tackling the issues around net zero. What I would say to him is that in terms of COP itself and the joint work we are doing across the world, there are a number of mechanisms that we have put in place which we will be continuing during this year, particularly when it comes to sustainable development.
Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Centre for International Environmental Law states that plastic pollution and global warming are linked. Given this, Mr. Speaker, does the Minister agree with me that we need to do far more to tackle the scourge of microplastic, microfibre pollution in our marine environment?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a very important point, but he knows on some of these areas we are leading across the world. He will also know that we have been leading in terms of getting countries to commit to the 30 by 30 commitment in terms of protecting our oceans and, of course, our lands.
Durham Jones, Mr. Speaker. The COP President hasn't set out which countries are his priority for enhanced NDCs in the run-up to COP27. Will he do so?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the Chair of the Select Committee knows, all countries have committed to come back by the end of 2022 in terms of their 2030 emission reduction targets, if necessary. But of course, the G20 are responsible for 80% of global emissions, and they will have to lead the way.
We now come to Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of the important steps that were made at COP26, but some of which were left incomplete, in his remaining time as COP President until November, what particular item will he be seeking to make the most progress on?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right. There are a whole range of commitments that were made. Some of these will continue beyond the end of 2022. But as I said, I think one of the key commitments that was made was countries to revisit their emissions reduction targets by the end of 2022, and be working with the COP presidency for COP27, Egypt, to ensure that countries deliver.
Shadow President Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2 months on from the COP, there is a worrying lack of momentum in this pivotal year, and that could get worse if we learn the wrong lessons from the energy crisis. Does the President agree with me that the lesson is not, as some in his own party would say, that we're moving too fast on green energy, but the opposite? We are moving too slowly, and our dependence on fossil fuels leaves us vulnerable. And therefore, the only way to keep 1.5 alive and provide energy security is to go further and faster on the climate transition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman know that the UK wants to have a managed transition to net zero, including in our energy mix. He will also know that it is under this government that we have led the world in terms of offshore wind, and he will also know that it is this government that is delivering investment in terms of nuclear to ensure we increase our baseload.
I have to say to him that consumers looking at their energy bills will be asking, if it's going so well, why are their bills rocketing and why are we so vulnerable? But we can only keep 1.5 alive if we have an energy policy that is fair at home and abroad. Now, many of the fossil fuel companies have made billions as a result of soaring prices, yet the government says we shouldn't tax them further because they are struggling. Isn't the truth we're only ever going to meet the Paris Agreement if we stand up to vested interests, including the oil and gas companies, and the fair and right approach is a windfall tax to help ease the real struggles, those faced by the British people?
Mr. Speaker, what we want to see is more private sector investment coming into offshore wind and indeed into renewables and increasing our green baseload. And he will have seen through the net zero strategy we have set out a plan for an extra £90 billion of investment from the private sector, and that is flowing in because of the actions of this government.
SNP spokesperson Deirdre Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our young people have led the fight for tougher climate change pledges for the world, so the world at least doesn't breach that 1.5 degrees of warming To support their activism, Scotland recently hosted the UN Conference of Youth ahead of COP26, has unveiled almost £1 million for a programme for young people in the climate conference and legacy activities, and signed up to the UNICEF Declaration on Children, Youth and Climate Change, along with countries like Norway, the Netherlands and Peru. The UK government hasn't signed up to that declaration. Will it, and when?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I certainly agree with her that we absolutely need to ensure that the voices of young people are heard loud and clear, and indeed they were at COP26, both in terms of civil society but also youth groups. And for the first time ever, leading into this COP, we set up a civil society and youth advisory group that helped us in terms of planning for the conference, in terms of the issues we were taking forward, and we will continue to engage with young people and civil society during our presidency year.
James Daly.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend will know, the government did put in place a new procurement policy which underlines the UK's global leadership in tackling climate change. Prospective suppliers bidding for contracts above £5 million a year must now have committed to the government's target of net zero by 2050 and have published a carbon reduction plan.
James Daly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In line with the COP26 goal of adapting to protect communities and natural habitats, what conversations has my right honourable friend had with colleagues to ensure government procurement of biodegradable face masks?
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises actually a very important point, and I can tell him that the Department for Health and Social Care is indeed actively exploring reusable face masks, reusable eye protection and reusable transparent masks, and I will ensure that the relevant minister from the department writes to him with more details.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the COP26 President knows, the Glasgow Climate Pact reaffirmed the ambition to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. He will also know that the International Energy Agency has made it really clear that if we're to meet that target, there can be no new oil, gas or coal projects. So will he make the case to the Secretary of State, to the Prime Minister, that the 40 new fossil fuel projects in the pipeline for approval in the UK are plainly incompatible with the agreement that he presided over?
Mr. Speaker, I wish sometimes the Honourable Lady would also praise the work the government is doing in terms of pushing forward on renewables. What I would say to her is that the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy has set out a consultation on a climate compatibility checkpoint when it comes to future licences, and she should write in and set out her views.
Andrew Leadsom.
Number 3, please.
Mr. Speaker, through the